All right. There's a question, what's going to happen on Monday? And I want to take it three different ways. One of them has to do with the fact that the Supreme Court on Monday will be hearing Donald Trump's immunity case. And for those of us who are not following the details, right, Donald Trump has been charged with, among other things, trying to interfere with the registering of the electoral results of the 2020 election, doing so by maybe mobilizing a group of people to invade the Capitol, maybe by interfering with particular state elected officials' efforts to register those results, by conspiring with others to organize a alternative slate of electors for certain states in order to muddy the waters about who won those states and then kick the procedure out of the Electoral College and into the House of Representatives, where the House might give the presidency to him. And in defense of himself, he and his lawyers have claimed, among other things, that he has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions undertaken while president or acting under the auspices of that office. And the lower courts have all rejected this claim, but it has now been appealed to the Supreme Court. The result of it being appealed to the Supreme Court is that many of the trials are currently on hold, especially the January 6th trial in the federal courts, which directly relates to this. And so the Supreme Court will be hearing arguments on this in the coming week. And I will just say very directly, I think there are only really two plausible scenarios here. One of them is that the Supreme Court completely rejects Trump and his lawyers' argument that there's complete immunity, or that they issue a decision that says, obviously there was incomplete immunity, and if you want to claim immunity for anything, you have to make a more specific and focused argument. And so the outcome of this case, I predict, will be that Trump loses, either loses completely and decisively, or loses in a way that pushes it back to the lower courts to then see if Trump can make any kind of argument about these actions in particular deserving immunity. Now, having said all of that, I also want to point out that in one respect, the slowness with which this issue has made its way through the courts, and in one respect, it's made its way through the courts relatively quickly, relative to maybe other issues in constitutional law, the fact that this has been argued ultimately in the lower courts, in the appellate court, now in the Supreme Court, all in the course of basically half a year. That's relatively quick pace for the American judicial system. We're fond of saying the wheels of justice turn slowly, but it may be that this, in another sense, is a victory for Donald Trump if the result is that the January 6th criminal trial does not proceed before the election. And as I've tried to say before, the judge in that trial is going to have an incredibly difficult decision to make, because Trump is, on the one hand, accused of serious criminal misconduct while president. And it seems like the American people have a strong public interest in determining whether or not that allegation actually is upheld by a jury of his peers. And the man running to be president of the United States, again, abused the power of his office and violated the law while in office, right? A jury of his peers might establish that in a way that we as a people have been unable to establish it in public opinion. So strong interest for proceeding with the trial, assuming, let us say, that there's a Supreme Court decision in July that allows this trial to proceed, or a lower court decision in August that allows parts of this trial to proceed. But there's a countervailing consideration, which of course is you have the nominating convention, and then you have the heat of the election in September, October, building up to November. And the American people also has an interest in one of its two main candidates being able to be out on the campaign trail and making the case for himself, as opposed to in the docket in a criminal trial defending himself. And so, how will the judge weigh those issues? I have no idea. And frankly, am a little skeptical because even if the judge decides that there will be a trial, Trump may appeal that, and the result may be that it's just too late by the time everything works its way out. And so the January 6th trials will not occur prior to the presidential election, and that clearly is advantageous for Trump. So that's question number one. The reason I say that I don't think that the Supreme Court will side with Trump on his incredibly ambitious claim that the President of the United States has complete immunity for criminal conduct done while in office under the auspices of his office is because that would effectively make the president above the law. There's no law that he can't violate while acting as president. And that's deeply incompatible with the idea that we live in a system that is ruled by laws and not men, right? And so I could be wrong, but I feel frankly like it would be such a damaging blow to the rule of law and the Constitution that even if we think about this just in terms of a kind of Madisonian theory of checks and balances, Madison famously said, well, we can't rely on all of these actors just on good principle not abusing their power. Let's give them institutional incentives to maintain their power by checking the other institutions. If the Supreme Court says the president is above the law, it cuts from underneath itself, the very foundations of a lot of its authority. So I'm not inclined to believe that the court will do that. Second question, way I could run with Flossie's question, what's going to happen on Monday? There's going to be opening arguments in a separate criminal prosecution of Donald Trump in New York City, in Manhattan, over the issue of whether or not he made fraudulent business reports in order to camouflage a payment that he directed his fixer Michael Cohen to make to the adult entertainer Stormy Daniels so that she would not go public in the middle of the presidential campaign with her allegation that she and Donald Trump had a brief affair in 2006, when, by the way, Donald Trump's youngest child was just 1 year old. Obviously, you could understand why, even if that allegation isn't true, Donald Trump would want it not to come out in the closing weeks of a presidential campaign. And by the way, it's not illegal to pay somebody to not say something about you, right? The question is, in so doing, and then taking this as a business expense deduction so that it was not obvious where the money went and that the money might be, in fact, a campaign expenditure, not a business expenditure, right? Did Donald Trump commit fraud? And so I don't know what's going to happen on Monday. There will be opening arguments, and I think one thing I can predict is that more attention will focus on these allegations against Donald Trump, and that this will be an unusual moment for the last, I want to say, almost 10 years. Donald Trump has been very effective at orchestrating attention in the American media system in ways that really, I think, we're still coming to grips with. The way in which our media system has been restructured by many-to-many social media, by Twitter, which he was a master of, and then by X and by his social media platform, by the emergence of digital media 24/7 news coverage that is segmented, with Fox News essentially amplifying the stuff that comes out on Twitter or Breitbart. He's been a master of manipulating the narrative of American public opinion formation. The attention that we focus has been in many ways directed at the stuff Trump wants us to be paying attention to. There's a really interesting history to be written there. I don't think we really have it yet, but I think we're slowly coming to grips with that. The reason I bring that up is because for the next few weeks, Donald Trump is going to be paid attention to in ways that I don't think he is happy about or that will be advantageous for him. He has worked for a long time on the basis of the maxim that there is no such thing as bad publicity. We will have to wait and see if maybe being charged criminally, being confined to a small courtroom, being forced to face his accusers and prosecuted may in fact be bad publicity for him. The countervailing consideration is that Trump is very good at playing the card that says, I'm being persecuted because I stand up for you, the card of grievance, right? And the question will be, I think there's no doubt that a substantial portion of his supporters may actually find their support redoubled by what's happening in the Manhattan courtroom. Right there, he is being forced to undergo this because he stood up for us. I think there's good evidence that roughly a third of the American people buy that narrative. But for the rest of us, and especially like critical voters in Arizona and Georgia and Michigan and Wisconsin, are some of them going to be reminded of what apparently we have a little bit of amnesia over, of how controversial, of how divisive Trump was, of how much he violates the norms of ceremony and sanctity that we tend to invest the presidency with, and if so, maybe this may be damaging to Donald Trump. I obviously am hedging a little bit here. I'm not entirely sure, but I think one thing that I am confident of is that for the next few weeks, we are going to be paying a lot of attention to allegations against Donald Trump that Donald Trump would prefer we not be paying much attention to. We know that in the last summer, when the congressional September. Yeah, I'm confusing my dates. January 11th inquiry, January 7th inquiry was proceeding, that it drove Trump down in the polls while people were paying more attention to those allegations. So that's Monday number two. Very quickly, Flossie, Monday number three is the on Monday, you ask an open-ended question, you get a long answer, right? Monday number three may be that Joe Biden will sign into law aid to the Ukraine and, by the way, to Israel and Taiwan and certain other allies. So we'll have to see how things progress in Congress. I'm not looking at my phone right now to know what's going on, but it appears that the House finally overcame the impasse, the veto that the Freedom Caucus was imposing on Ukraine aid in particular. The legislative details I don't think need to concern us here, but I do want to pay attention just for a moment at some of the stuff that the more extreme members of the Freedom Caucus are saying, right? Among other things, that aid for the Ukraine should be withheld until the Ukraine fully discloses all of the information it has about Hunter Biden's corrupt work for Burisma. The other things about the repression of language minorities in the Ukraine. And to be as clear as possible, this is really directly traceable in terms of like the origins of these stories to Russian propaganda operations. And so we come back to social media here for a second, and to the idea that our public sphere is very porous in the 21st century to outside influence that is directly propagandistic and designed to sow the seeds of conflict. And I emphasize that here because it clearly benefits Russia to have this aid delayed for months. It potentially jeopardizes our long-term strategic interests. I'm no longer of the opinion that Ukraine can possibly expel Russia from its territory. I think that the best hope here, if you're being strategic and thinking that Vladimir Putin needs to be made to pay a high price for his aggression in order to dissuade him from future aggression, is that this just becomes more and more costly, that it starts to perhaps lead him to worry that the cost of this war could undermine his domestic standing and power, and that the only thing the Ukraine has going for it is the supply of high-tech weapons that the West has offered it, right? Russia has a larger military, a larger and wealthier society, and it can just put wave after wave after wave of conscripted troops into the front lines of this battle, and eventually it overwhelms the Ukrainian capacity to defend itself unless Ukraine has really asymmetrically superior weaponry to compensate for the lack of troops. And the West is the only one that can provide the Ukraine with this. And so Russia benefits. If we don't, we haven't. Part of the reason we haven't is the porousness of our public sphere to Russian influence operations. And just notice for a minute how messy this is, right? How interwoven domestic and international politics are. And I think it's just it's illustrative of the moment we live in, and how complicated it is for the people of the United States to figure out, to sort out what's good information, what's bad information, when our representatives are amplifying propaganda that is being generated by one of our adversaries precisely to undermine our support for one of our allies. I'll stop there, but there are three things that I suspect will be in the newspaper on Monday. And I'm happy to take questions and thoughts about this before we move on, because I do intend to go back to the lectures that we've been doing the last few weeks on abortion, gender, sexuality, polarization in the courts. Anyone with a thought or a question before we move into the main topic? All right, I'm not seeing any one. If you've got a comment, unmute yourself or raise your hand. If not, I'm going to start with the slides. Give me just a moment here. Um, all right, there we are. So the topic that we've been discussing and that I intend to conclude today has multiple dimensions to it, right? Not just abortion, which is incredibly salient in our politics, a heated, divisive culture war issue, but the way in which it is inextricably connected to gender and sexuality, and the revolution that we've had in gender relations, in the tolerance and acceptance for homosexuality in our society over the last 50 to 75 years. And my suggestion to you has been that abortion, in a sense, is a window into those broader issues, that it allows those who are unhappy with the revolution in women's sexual freedom, but also more uh, broadly with women's equality in our society, represented, right, of course, by Kamala Harris and by Nikki Haley, as well as by the four women on the Supreme Court, the abortion is undeniably motivating for those who are mobilized on the basis of this issue because of its connection to these broader issues. That this is intrinsically polarizing because the gender transformation, the transformation in gender relations and roles, is one that has liberated and made more equal a majority of Americans, is clearly supported by a majority of Americans, but has also threatened and really upended the social expectations and is quite hostile to the capacity for people who are more traditional to reproduce their traditions over the course of multiple generations, and so intrinsically polarizing. I've suggested that abortion in particular may be reorganizing the partisan coalitions that have supported especially the Republicans in American electoral politics for roughly the last 50 years, may also be changing the motivation to vote or the level of mobilization of Democratic voters, and that we may be undergoing an a current subterranean earthquake in American politics as this issue plays out. I don't know. I'm not foolish enough to confidently predict. I just think that there is a deep change in the way people think about this issue when it is constitutionally protected as opposed to electorally decided. It changes the stakes of elections, the calculus of people voting, and the result may be a realignment in American politics. Today, continuing where we left off last week, I want to really underline the role of the courts in all of this, as opposed to the political implications. So let me refresh your memory that the courts have been on the cutting edge of this, going back to Griswold v. Connecticut, making contraception a legal right at first for married and then for basically all women in the United States, then making in Roe v. Wade abortion a legal right, then in a later decision of Bergefell making gay marriage a constitutional right. The court is deeply interwoven into the politics of gender and sexuality in America in the second half of the 20th century, the first quarter of the 21st century. And this has led to a focus on changing the composition of the federal judiciary on the part of conservatives. This is really brief review. Just remember, right? We've got now, right? Almost 30% of Black women saying that abortion is the most important issue for them in this election. 22% of Democratic women overall, 20% of women in states with abortion bans, 17% of women of childbearing years, and 43% of Republicans, 67% of independents saying that they support a federal protection for a federal right to abortion. Um, this comports very nicely with what we've seen in opinion polls about abortion in general in the United States. And so I'll be brief about this, but 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans in poll after poll after poll suggest that Roe v. Wade was correctly decided. And roughly a quarter of American women have had abortions in the Roe v. Wade or the post Roe v. Wade period. And the reason I juxtapose these two sets of data, right? We've got robust support for the Roe v. Wade decision, for a constitutional right to abortion, and yet we have a large number of people when they're polled also saying they support the Republican Party, and in that context, apparently being pro-life, right? And so the big, I think, thing that has changed is that it's harder to be pro-choice, to believe in a right to abortion, and to reconcile that with voting for pro-life candidates in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision. That's the political earthquake. The other thing that I'll point out, right, that one quarter of American women are having abortions, roughly speaking. In part, that's due to health complications, and abortion is sometimes a medically necessary procedure to save the life of the woman or to protect her fertility if the egg is implanted in the fallopian tubes as opposed to where it's supposed to implant in the uterus. And that these kinds of medically necessary abortions, though protected under some of the abortion ban or abortion restriction laws, become much more difficult to secure in states with these bans. That we combine that with the fact that women who gain access to abortions are able to complete education, start careers, marry the men they want to, develop the economic resources with which to support their families in the way they want to. And conversely, women who are denied access to abortion do not get to do all of that. And so we have to remember the reason this is a motivating issue is because of the human stakes behind this issue. In the same way that, by the way, this is a highly motivating issue for people who believe that abortion is the murder of an innocent life. So highly polarizing on both sides, but the movement of motivation into the pro-choice camp has really, I think, accelerated and deepened as a result of Roe v. Wade having been overturned. We have the court that we have in ways that we've looked at because there was a concerted, protracted, expensive, intelligent, strategic effort to transform the federal bench and the culture of constitutional law and its interpretation surrounding it. Um, this has given us a majority on the Supreme Court who is hostile to the idea of a living constitution, of a constitution whose key provisions are, quote, open textured, so that they lend themselves or even require interpretation, and that the interpretation should be carried out in light of the values of the current generation, our moral stance. This is sometimes called the moral reading of the Constitution, following Ronald Dworkin's important work on this topic. And this allows each generation to make the Constitution its own in terms of the way that it interprets the core values, the provisions, the doctrines of the Constitution. That has been rejected by the majority on the current court, who view themselves as originalist or textualist, interpretive stance, which says that you have to understand the Constitution according to the intentions of the framers or the meaning that the provisions in question had for the people who ratified it and worked with it in that first generation in which it was passed. And I have suggested to you, building on the work of Erwin Chemerinsky, but also Ronald Dworkin and many others, that there seem to be deep problems with originalism as an interpretive stance. One question is whether or not the founders actually intended us to read the Constitution in this way. And there seems to be some pretty good evidence, historically speaking, that they didn't. And so who are we to say we need to read the Constitution as it was originally intended if it was not intended to be read that way, right? It's almost self-refuting, right? But it's also incompatible, and I think this is the deeper problem. That's a kind of technical self-contradiction problem. But the deeper problem is with viewing ourselves as a democracy and viewing the people as sovereign over their Constitution. The Constitution's preamble begins with the ringing phrase, "We, the people of the United States of America, in order to secure a more perfect union." It speaks in the name of the people of the United States of America. Unless we believe that we, the people, existed in the 1780s, but have been dormant ever since, or only occasionally rise again to the project of constitution making or amending, we have to believe that we are the people of the United States. Those of us having this conversation right now constitute part of the current
Right.
sovereign people of the United States. It's our Constitution, and we need mechanisms to influence its interpretation. When six unelected officials can say to us, "We're going to tell you what the Constitution means, and we don't care what anybody else thinks." You do not have a society that is a constitutional democracy in which the people have an effective mechanism of sovereignty over their constitution. To be as clear as possible, you could say back to me, well, you could always amend the Constitution. You can always have a constitutional convention. I think that that's deeply misleading. No, you can't always amend the Constitution. The Constitution is designed to be incredibly difficult to amend. No, a constitutional convention is not always going to be productive. As polarized, as fractured as we are in the current decade, I can't see the Constitutional Convention of 2026 or 2028 being anything but a catastrophe. So, as opposed to that, we have institutionally dispersed interpretive debates about what the Constitution means. The Congress passes laws, the president signs and administers those laws, the court interprets those laws, and in so doing, they also jostle over what the meaning of the Constitution is. And the more responsive, the more accountable institutions of the federal government, Congress and the president, who regularly face the electorate, um, are co-responsible for interpreting and determining the meaning of the Constitution. The court should not have that power all by itself and should not use that power to impose 18th century reading on the Constitution if a stable majority of the American people have a 21st century reading that disagrees and consistently elect officials who are passing laws that reflect that understanding of the Constitution. So please note that this week it looks like there's a coalition in Arizona to overturn that 1864 abortion ban. Coalition of Democrats and Republicans, despite the fact that the Arizona legislature is controlled by Republicans, are going to work on that. That indicates that even in a relatively conservative state, some Republicans recognize that this is going to create difficulties for them because it is an unpopular position, even within their own party, to have a fairly complete abortion ban. If we continue drilling down on this, we notice also we have notes from the Constitutional Convention. We recognize that there was not a singular intent or meaning that came out of that convention. A lot of this was compromises, horse trading, last minute deals in which different people understood what they were doing to have different meanings. If that was the case at the convention, it certainly seems likely that that was also the case in the ratifying conventions and in the society as a whole. We are pluralistic, and we were pluralistic in the 18th century as well. We did not attach any single meaning to the Constitution. And that means that we can't go back and find that meaning. To be as clear as possible, you put all of these objections together, and it appears that originalism is a cover, an excuse, a camouflage for conservative justices finding conservative politics in the Constitution. I'm about to show you most Americans believe that the Supreme Court does not have a coherent, justifiable, principled constitutional stance guiding its reading of the Constitution. It looks increasingly like a um, partisan, another partisan institution. And again, another Keegan dissent in the Janus case, she says, right, our Constitution is made for better things than this. The First Amendment was made for better things than union busting. And so I worry damage both the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and the standing of the Constitution in our politics as a area of consensus or of at least um, diminished partisanship. And that if we become a society in which essentially respect for the Constitution is itself a partisan issue, we lose common rules that structure our politics that have been very valuable in keeping us from treating politics as a no holds barred kind of hardball competition. Um, so let me move on from there to just refresh your memory very quickly about all of the places that the current Supreme Court seems to be moving in directions that are really importantly at odds with what the majority of Americans seem to think. I'm just noticing. Thank you. So David is pointing out that the House passed the Ukraine aid bill in the Zoom. I was actually noticing that my phone was giving me an alert and trying to decide if I should look at it or not. But yes, update in the middle of the class. That piece of legislation has passed the House. It still has to get to the president. I'm sorry, it still has to get through the Senate, get to the president. But I think we expect that this will happen pretty quickly. Going back then to the fact that it's not just abortion, but it's also affirmative action and then issues to do with race, right? I mean, it's also the case that the Supreme Court has invalidated important elements of the Voting Rights Act. It's also the entire structure of our federal government, with Congress giving broad mandates to executive agencies, and then the president appointing cabinet level officials, sub cabinet level officials, and the civil servants in the particular agencies then figuring out how to act on the basis of the broad objectives that Congress allows these administrative agencies to enact in the form of regulation. The Supreme Court is increasingly uh, limiting the scope for action of executive agencies on what they call major questions without clearly conscribing the nature of what is a major question, leaving it very broad textured or open ended. This is making it very difficult for the Biden administration to enact environmental regulations, and the Supreme Court is increasingly challenging the way in which the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act have been implemented for 50 years now. On guns, I think it hardly needs noticing. On religion, the ability of states to fund private religious schools suggests that this court may have a different view of the relationship between church and state, or the separation of church and state, than has been the case for maybe the last 70 years. On unions, a variety of decisions are making it more difficult to unionize. And you bring all of this together, and it does appear that the court is increasingly out of step with what Americans want their government to be able to do under their Constitution, and the court does not seem to care. At least the majority of the majority seem not to care, right? I mean, I think Justice Roberts is a little bit more cautious in this regards. It may be that at points Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh was a little bit more cautious in this regard, but in general, it seems that the maximalist supremacist faction of the court, again, go back to Dobbs, the case in Mississippi did not require the court to overturn Roe v. Wade. It was not a case of Mississippi trying to ban all abortions, just trying to lower the restrictions to a 6-week period. The court could have said Roe allows those restrictions without overturning Roe, but it went further than it needed to do. It overturned Roe. And this is happening also, for instance, in the question about Section 3 of Article 14, whether or not the Supreme Court should interpret that pretty clear language as prohibiting, right, insurrectionists from serving in high federal office like the presidency. Well, maybe they shouldn't allow a single state court to make that ruling. But should they say only an act of Congress can decide that issue? That is doing more than they need to do, and doing it in a way that says we and only we have the authority to determine what the Constitution means. This is, I think, going to increasingly, on the one hand, um, call into question the legitimacy of the court as a form of constitutional principle and increasingly draw the focus of our politics onto these constitutional issues. So, how did we get here? Well, we got here in part because Donald Trump had 3 appointments to the court, and those 3 appointments are all highly conservative, originalist, and at least one or two of them maximalists as well. And so the shift from Ginsburg to Amy Coney Barrett is one of the most um, uh, institutionally significant shifts in a justice's ideology in recent history. There are very few other appointments that seem to have shifted the composition, the ideology, the center of gravity of the court as substantially as that decision. We then have a further question. Well, okay, Donald Trump got 3 appointments to the court. How unusual or peculiar is that? And here, starting with the diagram on the left, you will see that Obama, who served 2 terms, only got 2 appointments. That, right, Trump, who served 1 term, got 3 appointments. Mitch McConnell has a fair bit to do with that, redistributing one appointment that could have been Obama's to Trump. But then we also notice, right, that George W. Bush, 2-term president, got 2 appointments. Bill Clinton, 2-term president, got 2 appointments. But George H.W. Bush, 1-term appointment, president, got 2 appointments. And so there's a bit of luck, a bit of accident in all of this, as well as a bit of mischief for Mitch McConnell that results in 6 out of the 9 current justices being appointed by Republicans, despite the fact that Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency 7 out of the last 8 elections, right? Twice in that same period, a president has been the victor in the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote. But all of this helps us to understand how the court is so far out of step with the American people. You add to that, right? So right, the fact that 4 out of 9 justices have been appointed by presidents who did not win the majority of the popular vote. That when it comes to Senate confirmation, especially after the Democrats lowered the threshold to 50 votes, you have more justices just squeaking by and squeaking by with the support of senators who represent less than half of the population of the country. And so again, the idea that not just is the Supreme Court not accountable, but the mechanisms that determine how it is composed are not very good at registering the will of the majority of the American people. They are sometimes referred to as minoritarian institutions. And so I'm going to speak very quickly to two of those institutions. One of them is the Electoral College, and it has um, two distorting factors. The first is that it overrepresents the less populous states, and as you can see, comparing Wyoming to California, it vastly diminishes the value of a vote for the Senate in California, the most populous state, vis-a-vis the value of a vote in Wyoming, the most populous state. But it's also the case that it fractures the vote by peculiar geographic containers, right? So if it turns out that the people in the less populous, more powerful states are more proportionately powerful states, are also whiter, older, less well educated, more conservative, than the fact that we don't pool all of the people of the United States together into a single vote means that if whiter, older, more conservative, less educated people tend to, for a variety of reasons, live in these less populous, more powerful states, they end up having their influence over the outcome of presidential elections increased. We also have a Senate, and I like this graphic. I know I've showed it to you on multiple occasions before, where no matter what the populace of the state, every state gets two senators, right? And so in this diagram, we have 62 senators representing the same number of people as six senators, right? And again, the result is not just disproportionate power for the less populous states, it's also a skew in who has more power in terms of representation in the Senate. It turns out white people without a college education are the most disproportionately represented in the Senate. And the result of that is that it makes the Senate a more conservative institution than the people of the United States. The skew in the Senate, right, is more Republican, more conservative than the median voter in the United States. It overrepresents rural districts, it underrepresents urban districts. It has allowed a political party, the Republican Party, that is still basically very similar in the 2020s in terms of the racial composition of its voters to where it was in the 1950s. 90% of Republicans voting are still white, right? That this party gains its capacity to win elections, especially presidential elections and Senate elections, in part because of the way the constitutional machinery of the United States exaggerates the power of these less populous states in these key elections. The result of all of this is that Republicans are more often able to nominate people to the federal judge, to the federal bench, and get them approved by the Senate than are Democrats, and that the ideology of the people that Republicans nominate tends to be more extreme, more far to the right. The Democrats have a very hard time, I'm sorry, I should be over here, getting people who are very liberal onto the bench. They tend to have to nominate more moderate judges and justices to the bench. And so we have, to bring it all home, right, a federal judiciary that is more conservative than the people of the United States, starting to shape our law to accord with an interpretation of the Constitution that most of us disagree. I'll add one more thing very quickly, which is that the Supreme Court may be the most functional institution in the federal government of the United States right now. The thing Supreme Court watchers say is if you want to um, understand what the Supreme Court is going to do, you have to be able to count to five. That is to say, five people wearing black robes determine the meaning of the Constitution and what the rest of us can do through ordinary legislation as a result. They don't have to stand for election. They are not held accountable when they make unpopular decisions, at least not directly accountable. And so they are doubly powerful. Small minority necessary. They just have to vote once and not subject to any direct mechanism of accountability. The evidence is pretty clear. I think you can see the degree to which decisions on the court are unanimous goes up and down term by term, but it has gone up higher recently. But more important, I think the way in which we measure polarization on the court, do the justices appointed by one party, by the president who represents one party, all vote together? Do the justices appointed by the president of an opposite party all vote against when those justices are voting for? For most of the period from the 1950s to the late 2010s, the late 2000s, there wasn't a lot of polarization, not a lot of partisan behavior on the court, but that has gone up dramatically over the last decade. The result is that many Americans now view the court as a partisan institution and that the legitimacy of the court is suffering, right? We're up to the point where it's nearly as unpopular as Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And that's saying something, by the way, right? And I'm suggesting to you not only that, but this is a point where we may need the court to have some legitimacy given how fractured and fractious our politics are. So the final thing I want to suggest, and you will note that these are books I've tried to call your attention to in the past because I'm deeply interested in what lessons American history teaches us for a period like ours, when the people of the United States seem to be increasingly at odds with the majority on the Supreme Court and increasingly questioning the legitimacy of the majority of the Supreme Court to interpret our Constitution. The books I turn to, and I particularly like Larry Kramer's 20-year-old book, The People Themselves, which is a history of popular constitutionalism, especially in the 19th century, the idea that the people are the ultimate sovereigns in whose name the Constitution is made, and therefore the ultimate authority in determining how the Constitution should be interpreted. Michael Claremont of Harvard Law School, I think, was written a remarkable, compendious history of the framing of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution, and the way in which, in many ways, the framers tried to damp down popular constitutionalism, but the people pushed back and demanded that the Constitution remained an expression of their sovereign authority. Jason Frank points that there are these succession of constituent moments in which the people demand that they have authority over the very issue of what the nature of the people is, how expansive it is, who is included in it. And when we look at the origins of this, it goes back, I think, all the way to the British antecedents to the American Revolution. Bernard Bailyn has been extremely influential in suggesting that we need to understand the American revolutionaries' uh, uh, self understanding as being deeply informed by 17th century British politics, and in particular, the work of John Locke, arguably the single most important influential author on the character of the American Revolution. And his claim, and I'll read it very quickly, right? Nor can any edict of anybody else in what form soever conceived or by what power soever backed, have the force and obligation of a law which has not its sanction from that legislative which the public has chosen and appointed. For without this, the law could not have that which is absolutely necessary to its being law, the consent of the society, over whom nobody can have a power to make laws but by their consent. So the people are the supreme power, the origin of the power to make law. And the Supreme Court needs to be understood on this reading as the people's principles in interpreting the Constitution. We have a long history of thinking either that the people should be directly engaged in constitution writing and interpreting, that's the revolutionary period, or indirectly exercising constitutional authority through not just the Supreme Court and the appointment of justices to the court, but also through their ordinary election of presidents and members of Congress. Finally, more recently, we've been in the era of judicial supremacy, and I want to suggest that part of the reason that judicial supremacy, that the people don't have the authority to influence the interpretation of the Constitution, that all goes to the court, has been less controversial, is because until quite recently, originalism was not the interpretive philosophy of the majority of members of the court. Now that this is an originalist majority on the court, the problem with judicial supremacy really comes to the fore, which is it's the court saying it's their constitution, not our constitution, and using that authority to impose on us a reading of our constitution, confining and constraining what we can do with law that most of us reject. I want to say very, very briefly, and let me just uh, say this directly without use of the slides. I think two things. One of them is I have a very tentative hunch, and I have to be very careful. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not someone who does a lot of polling research myself. So I'm doing this on the basis of, as a political philosopher or theorist, of what think I see perhaps coalescing in our politics. And that hunch is that we may be becoming more focused on the court and the Constitution in the middle of the 2020s as we deal with the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, but more generally with a court that seems to be very aggressively moving in the direction of fundamentally revising constitutional law in ways that many of us are hostile to. And so that's one question, I guess, is the way I'll put it. Are we, in fact, entering a period in which we're going to spend more time in our politics thinking about, arguing about, focused on the role of the Constitution and the court in our politics? And if so, how does that change our politics? I think 2024 will be a really interesting test case in this regard. The second issue that I want to raise is it good for our politics that we do this? And here I want to suggest cautiously that it could be, that it could focus us on things that may be a little bit less polarizing, but also that summon perhaps a slightly more deliberative, slightly more principled, slightly less partisan approach to politics. Maybe I'm being pie in the sky idealistic about this, but it does seem to be based on the historical record. When we focused on the Constitution in the past, this has been healthy for our politics. It's put us into a more serious, a deeper mode of engagement because the gravity of the issues that we're discussing demand that we rise to the seriousness of figuring out what our Constitution should mean for us today. So I guess we will have to keep coming back to this and see if some of these more speculative conclusions are in fact borne out by the 2024 election and subsequent elections. I hope that this has underlined some interesting ways of thinking about contemporary American politics. I will stop there. I want to hear your thoughts and comments on all of this. Who wants to start us out? John, go ahead. It looks like you're unmuted. Yes, hi.
Hi. I take your point. I think you're describing the situation accurately, but as far as of the response by Democrats or liberals, among whom, of course, I include myself, I see little but reason for despair. Conservative politicians and movements are so much smarter than we are, while the liberals continually, I don't know, want to say shoot yourself on the foot. The Gaza thing, for example, is a real super difficult issue. But the politics of it is that it split the Democratic Party down to the point where, they're going to be protests at the Chicago Convention again. Last time we had those wasn't too successful politically. So it's really remarkable how badly Democrats have played their hands in the last decade, 15 years or so. I mean, Republicans are so much smarter.
Interesting. So smarter in a strategic sense.
Yeah, I didn't mean passing the examinations or anything or other, but I mean McConnell, of course, is probably the best congressional politician we've had since Lyndon Johnson, and that's counted for a lot. I mean, you say it was slippery behavior on his part, but it's nothing that any smart politician wouldn't have done to delay that appointment to the Supreme Court if they could do it. Who wouldn't do that? So anyway, I mean, partly it's coincidence, but it's still striking. I mean, I really see. I hope somebody can come up with something optimistic because I would rather be cheerful than morose.
Well, and so let me start by saying, on the last issue, who wouldn't have done what McConnell did at the end of the Obama presidency? And frankly, McConnell didn't do it again, right at the end of the Trump presidency. But frankly, no other leader of the Senate had done this in 200 plus years of American history, right? And there are multiple occasions when there have been openings on the Supreme Court in the final year of a president's term.
How many cases of that have there been?
So I don't have the precise number, but I believe at least a handful, right? And so the other thing that I'll add is that the Constitution, of course, says that the Senate has a duty to consent and advise, but it doesn't say in what time frame. So it permitted McConnell to do what he did, and the issue here is in part about the degree to which the letter of the Constitution doesn't interpret itself. It needs people to also in some sense, have their view about the spirit of the Constitution. How long a delay is too long a delay in these cases. I don't want to relitigate that, but I do want to suggest that, in a sense, that what McConnell did was required by the fact that the Republican Party had been promising its constituencies that it was going to change the court for decades. That if it would have allowed, right, Scalia to be replaced by Garland, it would have completely capitulated on this issue. So in a sense, it was almost necessary for McConnell to do this without committing maybe electoral suicide on behalf of his party. And Mitch McConnell is a very gifted legislative politician, right? And so he didn't do that. And I think there's a story to be told in which that's probably one of the key factors that got Trump the presidency. So having said all of that, let's come back to, is it just Mitch McConnell? Isn't it just this one issue? Or are the Democrats just terminally flat-footed, internally divided, et cetera? And here I would say there is something to be said for the fact that the Republicans are a more ideologically homogenous party, right? The range of views within the Republican Party is more narrowly and purely conservative than what we have with the Democratic Party, in which there are people pretty far to the left, but also centrist, and the bigger spread of views makes it more difficult for the Democrats to be as strategic, as unified, and this sometimes results in self-damaging behavior. I want to add that I'm inclined to prefer an ideologically um, uh, heterogeneous party, a big tent party, to the narrow tent party. And that one of the things we see with the Democrats is that they've actually been, in certain respects, better at legislating, right? In part, that's because they want to legislate. The Republicans may not want to. But I think if you look at the spectacle of what's happening in the House, including today, right? Mike Johnson is getting this legislation passed, but perhaps at the expense of votes that will torpedo his own speakership, or certainly at the expense of further alienating one important caucus within his own party, a caucus to which he formerly belonged. And so I I think legislatively it might be a little bit more complicated than you're suggesting, John. Electorally, yes, the Democratic Party has had its troubles, and maybe the shift into constitutional politics wouldn't help them. I'm inclined to think it might just, and that's kind of the case I've been trying to make to you today. David, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead. I did mute you a moment ago because we were getting some feedback, so you need to unmute yourself. There you
I
go.
just wanted to comment on John's comment, and that is, I find it ironic that the scholars who told us about the importance of controlling narratives and myths and how to survive in really a post-truth society are politically radically left, people like George Lakoff, for example. But I really think that the Republicans have read that research and built their public relations strategy on exactly that logic. Another way of looking at it is that the Republicans are doing a much better job of living in a post-truth society than Democrats are. I think liberals are very naive, and they really live by the Enlightenment ideal of know the truth and the truth shall make you free. Going back to that spirit, and I just think that they're more comfortable with old-fashioned, state your opinion, but go in and mix it up and make compromises and let the sausage rain and get something out of it at the end. And that hasn't worked well for us, although it seemed to have worked today. I will grant them that. But I just think that Democrats don't have a very good controlling narrative about that appeals more broadly than just to rank and file Democrats.
David, let me congratulate you on the phrase, let the sausage rain.
Yes, long live the reign of the sausage. So I'll be very brief about this. I'm doing a lot of thinking about this right now, and so I'm tempted to go on and on. But I think I want to save it and spend some more concerted time on the question of what it means to have a substantial segment of our media system, a substantial segment of our population, and one of our two main parties, I think, accurately characterized as post-truth, right? Not in any way restricted by the veracity or the verifiability of the information on which they rely. That's a really different kind of dynamic of public opinion formation. It's not just than the liberals who are, maybe naively still committed to reality-based justification. I think it's a really different world from the Enlightenment thought that informed the founding of practically every democratic society in the world, right? And so it's a deep challenge to democracy if a substantial portion of the population does not care for the discipline of the ability to confirm or disconfirm the factual basis on which their politics rests. I would point out, and I'll do my best to be brief here, that I don't think this is all about media, all about technology. I think that's important. I do think it's in part also about Trump, that he, in a really savvy way, in a way that was probably more instinctual than intellectual, understood the new openings for post-truth politics that this new media environment created. But I also think it's about the nature of the situation of the people who are amenable to this kind of political manipulation, right? What is it that changed in American society to make a substantial fraction of our population hostile to experts, hostile to the elite, hostile to the mainstream media, hostile to liberals, right? And what is it that made them hungry for conspiracy theory kind of explanations for what was going on in their life? I think we need to have that conversation as well. And there I do think, frankly, failures of liberalism are in part responsible for the growth of the viability of post-truth politics over the last decade. But now I'm kind of making assertions that I haven't provided any evidence for. I'll try to do that in future talks that we'll have together. David, go ahead. I'll let you have the last word for today.
Well, I just wanted to say I agree with you that it's mainly Trump, but I think you can see the beginnings of this going back even further. I think Karl Rove in the Bush II administration was a master at this in terms of some of the big campaigns that they had on the war and on and education and the like. And I suppose you could argue that Newt Gingrich and the moral majority, and maybe even Ronald Reagan's turn away from his Democratic roots to Republicanism. There's an inkling of this notion of how to run a populist campaign that is driven by myth and controlling narrative rather than any analysis of the facts of the situation.
And I don't want us politicians or scientists, social scientists or natural scientists, we don't just go where the truth takes us, right? We have our principles, as Max famously said, echoing Luther. Part of what makes a great politician is their willingness to say, here I stand, I can do no other. Right? We want politicians who don't just always go wherever the current policy wonk thinking takes them. But having said that, I believe you're absolutely right to point to Rush Limbaugh and the total lack of discipline by mainstream media of right-wing AM talk radio in the 1980s and 1990s with the falling away of federal regulations of that area of journalism. And then there was one other thing that you said. I'm losing it. We've been going on for quite a while. I want to come back to these topics. I hope that we've at least got a handle on some of the stuff to do with abortion and the judiciary. John, it looks like you've got another point. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I muted you trying to unmute you. Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Just wanted to add to the litany of conservative heroes that David came up with. Don't forget Kevin Phillips in the Southern Strategy. I think underlying all of even, post 1960s, 1950 American politics is largely due to racial politics, the switch of the South to the Republican Party and how well that was exploited.
You're reminding me of what I was forgetting in response to David's initial comment. I remember in 2002 when Karl Rove said, and famously, right, we are not part of the reality-based community. I remember scratching my head trying to make sense of that statement. Wow. In light of the last 20 years, what an incredibly prophetic statement about the Republican Party and the direction it was moving in. Rove got it, I think, in a sense, much earlier than us naive liberals who were saying, what other community is there, right? And lo and behold, we now have a whole segment of our population, of our media system, and one of our two main parties that does not belong to the reality-based community. How's that for a happy note to conclude on? Take care, everyone. Have good weeks. Wonderful as always being with you. See you next week. Thanks so much. Bye, guys.